Shadow moves like an orbit, returning to the same scuffed patch beneath the tent as if gravity is localized there. The dog lowers his head, breathes the soil, and paws with a careful insistence that feels like suggestion rather than demand. Orville watches the ritual repeat through hours and weather, noting the patient rhythm, the way Shadow's body stiffens before each pawing, as though hearing a quiet sound beneath the world. There is no drama in it, only repetition and purpose. The tracks around the spot form a map of belief, circles, arcs, a single line pressed by a forepaw where hesitation vanishes. Orville kneels and places his palm flat upon the dirt. The ground returns pressure like a held secret. The old shame rises, conditioned by years of glances and smirks. Yet it meets a new sensation, a faint hollowness, almost musical, responding to his weight. Shadow waits without blinking, a companion offering a wordless yes. The memory arrives with the taste of iron and lamp smoke, a room small enough to hold breath and fear together. His father lay narrow against the mattress, eyes like flints, throwing sparks at each sentence. The words did not beg or plead, they appointed. Guard the canvas, accept the laughter, understand the difference between money and worth. Orville had nodded because sons nod when endings approach. But the instruction grew larger across years, a map that kept unfolding until the table vanished. He had wondered if the old man had misjudged him, if the choice of air was habit rather than belief. Now, with Shadow's restlessness and the ground's faint surrender, the directive sharpens. He realizes duty sometimes arrives disguised as embarrassment, because ridicule is the most reliable lock. He stands from the memory with something like alignment. The tent is no eyesore. It is a boundary line between appetite and promise.
Sterling appears like weather, smiling as if he brings relief. He carries prosperity the way others carry tools, a visible competence that convinces the uncertain to borrow his certainty. He surveys the ridge with hands tucked easily behind his back, eyebrows calculating distances, costs, outcomes. The offer arrives wrapped in concern, dressed to resemble rescue. Orville feels its weight settle on familiar bruises. Fresh start, fair price, dignity salvaged by surrender. The arithmetic is pristine, but the math leaves out the ledger he cannot ignore. Sterling's gaze rests on the tent longer than courtesy requires, as though listening for a signal beneath the canvas. When he leaves, the ridge feels thinner, the horizon closer. Orville senses how influence can summon roads out of thin air, how a man with reach can relocate danger without raising his voice. Shadow watches the departing figure, not with growl or chase, but with the steady regard of recognition. Night collects around the cabin in layers that trap the day's voices. At the table, Orville flattens the old letter between his palms, tracing creases as if reading a coastline. The handwriting is careful, more durable than speech, its curves suggesting patience under pressure. He tastes the waste, meals not bought, debts sorted through endurance rather than coin, years spent paying for something invisible to everyone else. The town's laughter unlatches in memory, casual, communal, efficient. He had learned to survive inside it by becoming an absence, neither target nor participant, a man whose quiet kept him from catching fire. Now the quiet works differently. It behaves like storage, holding choice until he is ready to lift it. Outside, the tent claps softly at its moorings. Shadow sleeps near the door, but not deeply, ears tuned to the ridge. Before the lamp goes dim, Orville understands the next step is not belief, it is proof.
Clouds marshal along the edge of the sky, like a line of cavalry choosing ground. The ridge darkens into shape rather than color, everything becoming silhouette and texture. Orville carries tools without ceremony, feeling their handles like old arguments he finally intends to win. Shadow moves beside him, choosing the windward side as though measuring scent for news. The tent lurches on a cross-gust, and the line snatches his palm. He braces, and the fabric steadies. The ground under Shadow's paws receives him like a habit resumed. When Orville kneels, the soil releases a dry breath against his face. He presses the blade of the shovel through stubble and root, discovering how quickly resistance becomes invitation when intention is constant. The world above thunders its impatience. He answers with a rhythm that shortens thought and lengthens faith. The wind scrapes the canvas in long strokes, as if erasing doubt in a coarse hand. The first depth arrives in inches, then in inches that pretend to be feet. Orville understands why the patient are called stubborn by those who fear time. He moves the shovel through the ground's old grammar, learning where the sentence holds and where it loosens. The sound changes before the substance does, a clearer note lifted out of the soil's muffled chorus. Shadow tilts his head as if hearing a chord resolve. Orville brushes aside the last layer with fingers and feels the flat refusal of worked wood. There is intention in the plane, a choice that has survived weather and doubt and men who needed proof to continue. He palms the surface and counts the edges. The rectangle travels farther than comfort. He feels history reach up and take his wrist, not with force, but with recognition, as if to say that this, at last, is the point where lineage becomes action.
He excavates perimeter before center, a habit learned from repairing fencing. Stabilize the frame, and the heart will behave. The wood reveals joinery too precise for accident, a geometry of endurance. Someone built to outlast storms and impatience, intending secrecy to be measured in lifetimes. Shadow sits at the lip of the hole and offers stillness as permission. The ground cools as he descends, air shifting from night warm to cellar chill. Orville traces pitch with his knuckles, and the tar leaves a faint scent of pine and smoke. He considers the simplicity at the surface and the architecture beneath, the way a joke can be constructed to guard a covenant. The tent above creaks and answers the earth below, two halves of a long sentence finally touching its verb. The silence that follows is not empty, it is sworn. He recognizes the boundary between curiosity and commitment and steps over it. Hoofbeats approach in an even cadence that pretends to be casual. Sound finds its way down the hole in precise portions, as if counted and poured. Orville douses the lantern to a thinner whisper and becomes patient with breath. Shadow's body leans toward the road, but he remains, choosing duty over pursuit. In the dim, the rider's silhouette glides along the fence line, pauses, and adjusts posture like a man making a note. Sterling has the gift of moving slowly while stealing time. He lets the horse rest as if courtesy were his mission, then proceeds with an indifference too clean to be honest. Orville feels the claim in that pause, that silent insistence that any unguarded thing belongs to a competent hand. When the hoofbeats fade, the ridge seems changed, as if ownership were a sound that lingers. He relights the lantern, smaller now, and resumes, accepting the cost of being seen.
The hatch answers the knife with a brittle music, pitch yielding in thin curls that shine like wet licorice. Hinges, long asleep, move without complaint, the kind of forgiveness that only craftsmanship can teach. Air rises from the dark as if poured through cloth, smelling of paper saved and metal kept honest. The first step groans a warning and holds. Orville tests each tread, learning their voices, measuring trust one board at a time. Shadow waits above, head lowered into the opening, a silent tether to sky. The chamber receives the lantern's circle reluctantly, then accepts it, disclosing corners and walls with modest pride. Nothing glitters yet. The feeling is older than wealth, closer to intention.
It is a room that understands custody. Orville touches plank and beam and senses the hours those boards contain. Memory doesn't live here, it is housed here, stacked and sealed like a long breath. They sit against the far wall like patient elders, lids smoothed by hands that understood both hurry and permanence. The first opens with a sigh that makes dust move like prayer. Gold and silver announce themselves without ceremony, metal catching flame and reflecting it back as law. Orville does not reach immediately. He lets the brightness adjust to his presence, as if value were light shy of strangers. When he finally lifts a coin, weight confirms what sight suggests. It belongs to no single era, the markings telling a story without asking permission. Beneath, cloth-wrapped parcels yield to care, revealing jewelry whose purpose was once declaration. Shadow, above, gives a single low bark that is less alarm than reminder. This is not the end of searching. The room feels older than acquisition, and his palm on the metal feels clumsy. He sets the coin down and looks for what wealth often tries to bury.
The leather-bound volume answers touched with a sturdiness that outlives fashion. Orville opens to a parade of names, some written like vows, others scratched like confessions. Ink tells on lineage, pressure betrays intent. Crossed lines reveal endings not caused by time. Margins carry notes like whispers passed during danger. A familiar surname surfaces from the page like a hand from water. Maddox, anchored to dates that disturb. The ledger breathes an older ethic, one that knew how to separate guardianship from ownership, even when grief and greed crowded the same table. The book is a map of pain traded for safety, a chart of trust assigned to men who pledged silence thicker than blood. Orville feels the room tilt again, but this time toward clarity. The gold dazzles, the ledger conducts. He understands that proof has a temperature, and this volume holds the fever that will break lies. He closes it like a promise. He lingers to learn the room's pulse, understanding that discovery is not a way out, but a way in. The ledger reorganizes everything he believed about duty, exchanging romance for arithmetic. His family did not guard abundance, they contained a hazard. Wealth like this concentrates violence, and a town is a vessel easily cracked. He imagines the years of poverty, paid in exchange for keeping the peace soluble. The realization does not ignite pride, it settles a ledger inside him. He weighs outcomes and sees how fast affection becomes appetite once proof is public. The coins shine with the power to reorder loyalty. He places coverings back as they were, a ritual of respect that composes his breathing. Shadow's claws tap at the hatch above, a pulse returning him to surface. The dog's presence names what must be kept simple: protect, document, decide. He carries the ledger out like a sleeping child. When did memory synchronize as he climbs, the world above reasserting its claim through sound? His father's face returns not as portrait, but as posture, jaw set against ridicule, eyes measuring time by patience, hands occupied to keep anger from spilling. The old injunction occupies more space now. It was never about hoarding fortune or winning some future argument. It was about absorbing the storm so others did not drown. Orville stands beside the torn tent and understands why shame was the chosen camouflage. Ridicule keeps greedy men lazy. He feels a thin gratitude that the laughter worked as intended. Shadow presses against his leg and smells the ledger, then the air, as if performing a benediction. Orville relashes the canvas with a precision that borders on reverence. The ridge holds its breath. Duty, once a rumor inside his chest, has become a boundary line he can see and step across deliberately. Morning comes trimmed in certainty, and Sterling returns with the posture of a man who has already purchased the view. He walks the perimeter without touching, a surveyor who measures ownership through gaze alone. His words carry nothing so crude as threat, they carry schedule. The implication is simple: when men like him move, the world agrees. Orville notes the way Sterling catalogs details: the angle of the tent, the tracks in the dust, the neatness of the ropes, building a case out of weather and habit. Restraint is the merchant's preferred weapon. Impatience is left to hirelings. Orville senses the net forming, threads knotted in places where law and influence trade favors. Shadow positions himself between men, not to challenge, simply to state presence. The ridge learns a new silence after Sterling departs, a quiet full of paperwork and signatures not yet written. Orville sees the countdown he did not ask to begin.
He chooses the far end of town where boardwalks make less noise and judgment travels slower. Nora's house wears usefulness without apology. Clean steps, a door that opens on the first knock, the smell of coffee inhabiting each room like a guardian. She is not surprised to see him because she is not surprised by much. Her steadiness changes time's tempo. Frantic things surrender their speed at her threshold. He explains enough to establish urgency without colliding into panic. She absorbs the facts with the competence of someone who has mended more than fabric. Her rooms seem built for concentration. Shadow circles once and settles, accepting her like a familiar landmark. Orville recognizes in Nora a precision the ledger will respect, a way of reading that does not seek permission from pride. He understands that belief is not what he needs from her. He needs verification shaped by courage, and she has both. Steam lifts from mugs and blurs the edge of worry. Orville maps the chamber in words, tracing joinery, cataloging seals, returning to the ledger's pages with a carefulness that protects their shape inside the telling. He describes the sensation of standing where a century had been stacked and sealed, the weight of names written like anchors. Nora listens in a way that sorts noise from signal, her questions tucked into nods, her silence drawing complete sentences out of half-formed fear. The dog watches both faces, tracking tone rather than diction, committing the new alliance to memory. The house holds them without eavesdropping. When the facts arrange themselves, Nora folds purpose into the plan. Document first, preserve sequence, copy everything with precision that can withstand arguments. Orville feels the narrative inside him shift from burden to brief. The coffee cools and the problem warms into structure. Outside, weather rehearses its next move. Ink gathers on pages that will outlast breath. They work by lamplight, finding the rhythm that makes fidelity faster than haste. Nora's hands find a corner torn by time and stabilize it with tape so thin it feels like permission. Each name becomes a point of reference rather than a demand. The ledger allows reproduction but insists upon respect. They comply, keeping margins clear, preserving notations that sound like weary warnings. Shadow changes positions with the hour, traveling from door to hearth and back again, assembling a guard route that requires no instruction. Orville senses how competence calms fear, how procedure is the antidote to panic when power begins to move. The plan resolves into steps. Keep the ledger, store copies in separate places, prepare a controlled disclosure. He chooses action over waiting and feels the old shame lose leverage. The ridge still holds storms, but now the house holds strategy. Footfall scatters gravel in a rhythm too delicate for animals. Shadow rises before the knock that never comes, body angling toward the window, chest expanding with quiet that promises conversion into sound if needed. Nora lowers the lamp until the room becomes shape and intention. Orville eases the ledger into a satchel that closes without speaking. Outside, men practice courage near the fence line, testing the boundary between curiosity and trespass. The ridge returns a small answer, a gust that lifts canvas and reveals nothing. Shadow's growl remains low enough to belong to furniture. The men retreat when their nerve fails to become plan.
A silhouette pauses long enough to claim authorship. Sterling favors distance even when he directs proximity. The night swallows presence as easily as it releases it. Inside, the three of them learn how danger behaves when it believes itself patient. The clock marks the hour, without offering advice.
Morning brings paper with the authority of printed letters and an arrogance sharpened by legal phrasing. Sterling announces intention the way generals announce maneuvers, calm, inevitable, scheduled. The phrase, abandoned colonial property, harms by implication, turning guardianship into negligence with a single adjective. Sundown arrives as a new kind of horizon, not painted by weather but by procedure. Orville considers the calendar of courage and sees that waiting converts truth into prey. Nora parses the letter and extracts the method from the menace. They agree without speech that disclosure must be orchestrated rather than allowed. Shadow presses his head against Orville's thigh and steadies the human with animal gravity. The ridge wears the deadline like a collar, snug but not strangling, spurring speed without inviting mistakes. Orville knots the tent lines again, tighter than yesterday, as if firm knots could hold time briefly in place. The chamber receives them with the tempered welcome of a vault that recognizes familiar hands. Orville follows memory to a section of wall that felt like question, and the question opens into a second chest, lying stern as a judge. Inside, documents shift loyalties in an instant. Deeds unroll into histories that include Nora's late husband, a name tethered to a parcel now held by others. The room tightens around the living. Orville feels choices crowd, each angling for virtue. Nora reads with a kind of mercy that does not dilute accuracy. Shadow steps down the last stair and rests his muzzle on the wood as if anchoring them to the present. The map of loss extends across generations, but the ledger's ethic remains: custody without conquest. Orville steadies himself against the old timber and understands that truth will ask for sacrifice where applause is loudest. He closes the chest and keeps his hands open.
On the ridge, clouds lower like a ceiling, reconsidering its job. They stand in wind that flattens hair and grants clarity. Orville calculates the fire's convenience, imagines ash carrying names out of reach. The temptation offers clean lines, an immediate erasure that protects love by starving history. Nora answers without words, only presence and the fidelity of standing beside him rather than opposite. The choice speaks its own rationale. Truth does not belong to whoever holds it. It belongs to those whose lives it describes. The understanding makes room for grief that does not look for enemies. Orville decides to preserve every page, even those that could bruise gratitude. Shadow leans against his knee and turns his face into the wind, accepting discomfort as weather rather than punishment. Together they find the discipline that gives honesty teeth. The storm steps closer, invited by courage it does not intend despair. Rain comes in sheets that turn distance into rumor. The tent thrashes at its moorings, fabric snapping like fresh orders. The ridge bleeds rivulets into the cut, and the cut begins to remember the river it once was. Orville moves with deliberate economy, sealing, shoring, guiding water, so the chamber does not swallow more than it can return. Shadow barks once, not at threat, but at speed. Nora ties off lines with a sailor's competence, anchoring canvas to stubborn earth. The storm tests craft and conviction at once. The hatch drinks water and resists. The lantern hisses and holds. Decisions shrink into motions, each chosen for survival rather than appearance. The ridge becomes a single task, and the task is endurance. When the worst gust passes, the tent remains, diminished yet upright, like a man who has taken a blow and declined to sit. The water recedes enough to invite the next wager.
They come edged by rain, figures outlined in a weather that flatters resolve. Sterling walks at the point as if leading a procession rather than a raid. Papers appear like weapons that will not rust. He claims jurisdiction with phrases trained to overrule conscience. The men behind him stand without faces, hired certainty holding its breath. Orville measures the distance between principle and provocation and refuses to close it. Nora stands at his shoulder, not as shield, but as witness. The storm alters logistics. Authority cannot travel quickly when the road is a river. In this interval, law is simply what the ridge will sustain. Sterling declares outcomes with the confidence of someone who has always been believed. The wind cuts his speech into segments and feeds them to the ground. Shadow does not bark. He chooses position, placing his body where path narrows. The weather announces that time has changed sides. Water finds low places the way greed finds loopholes. The hatch lifts under pressure and exhales a cold breath that smells of timber and risk. Shadow drops into the dim without seeking permission, absorbed by purpose. Orville follows, feeling each rung as a separate decision. The lantern's glow converts flood into glint and panic into plan. Treasures loosen inside their boxes with a sound too soft for tragedy. The coin seems eager to relearn the language of rivers. Orville chooses triage and reaches for the ledger, because story can rebuild value where gold cannot. He braces the book against his body and shoulders through the rising chill, guiding Shadow toward the ladder with words shaped into tone rather than speech. Above, Rain applauds both failure and success with equal enthusiasm. They emerge soaked and altered, carrying the one artifact that can still turn accusation into confession.
Light reveals what the night revised. The tent has lost its swagger, but not its function. Lines hold with the dignity of work well done under imperfect conditions. The ridge smells of wet iron and pine pitch, a fragrance that could be named endurance. Orville sits with his back against a post, Shadow pressed to his side, the ledger wrapped inside oiled cloth that seems to have grown smarter with time. He inventories damage and finds mercy efficiently distributed. Loss exists without spectacle. Survival speaks without shouting. Nora emerges with bandages for scrapes and a new plan arranged in her eyes. The world did not end, it reorganized. Sterling remains a problem measured in paper and appetite, but daylight grants visibility to small victories. Orville understands that triumph rarely arrives wearing triumph's clothes. It enters as breath returned to lungs, and the knowledge that the next step is still possible. Word spreads the way it always does, in the shape of certainty borrowed from the loudest source. People arrive looking for spectacle and leave room for conversion only if spectacle fails to feed them. Orville chooses a table under light that forgives no stain and sets the ledger where all can see its honest spine. He speaks without flourish, offering sequence instead of performance. How a tent became ridicule, how ridicule disguised a vault, how a vault preserved a problem larger than any single household. Nora verifies without theatrics, reading dates and seals in tones that sound like craftsmanship. The crowd listens because the story has weight. Shadow curls at Orville's boot, awake in a way that announces steadiness rather than threat. The room learns the discipline of quiet as names arrange themselves into a pattern that cannot be dismissed. The air takes on the density of decision.
Revelation travels through the hall with the speed of heat finding metal. The ledger does not accuse, it describes. Description proves more devastating than anger because it requires no rehearsal. Sterling's lineage appears on the page wearing yesterday's certainty, and certainty cracks when sunlight touches it. The crowd experiences the rare sensation of being surprised by their own willingness to believe lies that made living simpler. Orville notes the change not by sound, but by posture. Shoulders that once leaned forward to scoff now stand back to receive. Nora closes the ledger gently,
as one closes a wound after cleaning. The room exhales. No cheer rises, no victory colonizes the space. What enters instead is recognition, shaped like shame, and then gratitude. Sterling remains, diminished not by volume, but by context. Shadow shifts and resettles, as if marking the moment when guardianship returns to the community that once abandoned it. Weeks later, the ridge carries a different quiet. The tent stands whole, stitches visible like a map of choices repaired. Orville leaves the patches unpainted, so memory has texture. He keeps the ledger in a place that is neither display nor hiding, revisiting it when decisions require calibration. He does not hold the gold because he does not need the lesson it offers. He holds the truth because it keeps the town honest. Nora manages the work that follows: letters, copies, acknowledgments, turning crisis into administration, which is how peace keeps. Sterling's name survives as a caution rather than a claim. Shadow lies in the tent's shade each afternoon, a dark comma at the end of a long sentence that no longer trembles. When the wind rises, the canvas speaks in a steadier voice. The town calls it the keeper's tent now, and Orville finally walks past it without bracing.
Lantern glass bursts against the pine floor as the town hall erupts, coins skittering like startled minnows. Faces surge forward, hungry for proof, hungrier for a share. Sterling stands at the center of the commotion, owning the noise, shaping it with the confidence of a man used to winning. The chests look smaller in this light, more fragile, as if truth itself could be pried apart with paper and poise. Shadow plants himself before them, fur bristling, eyes steady. Orville feels the room tilt around him, the air thinning under the heat of accusation and certainty. He recognizes a trap sprung too cleanly to be chance. All the laughter that once followed him has consolidated into a single verdict taking shape. He reaches for the ledger that matters most and senses how quickly a life can become evidence. 4 nights earlier, the wind worried a torn canvas on an empty ridge. On the ridge, the torn tent pulls and shudders like a wounded flag. It seems speaking in the language of years. Orville knots fresh lines into old fabric, fingers remembering the tension as though the rope keeps more than canvas steady. The path from town gleams with footsteps and judgment. He imagines each heel mark stamping a verdict into dust. Mockery drifts easily across open ground, carried by habit and distance. He works in silence that feels practiced, like a vow taken long ago and renewed each morning. The tent is not a shelter so much as an intention, a sign left where signs do not belong. When the last knot settles, the canvas flutters into uneasy calm. He steps back, measuring angles against memory, recalculating the way a man measures seasons by what refuses to fall. In the hush after the wind, he hears his father's breath again, thin but commanding, insisting on the place.